So welcome to the record webinar. And so this is just the agenda. This is what we're going to kind of be going over. We'll be going over micro exempt and covered farms, specifically with records, because this one is focused on records, qualified exempt, commercial exempt, since there are specific record requirements for those that are a little bit different from covered farms, record requirements specifically for each of those exemptions and covered farms, what inspections would look like, resources, and then of course questions at the end. However, feel free to put them in the chat or come off mute if you have any questions during the webinar as well. I'd be happy to answer them during, so feel free to do that as well. So we'll just kind of start getting into it. So for micro exempt, what does that mean? So that means that your produce sales for your 3-year rolling average is below 30,509, because with the produce safety rule, there is a sales threshold. So that is what it is currently. The FDA just released their new number, but that won't be relevant until you are registering with the state of Colorado in November. That number is 31,925. So just a little bit above that $30,000 threshold. Now, what does that mean as far as records go? So if you are micro exempt, you wouldn't fall under the produce safety rule. However, we always encourage micro exempt farms to kind of know what the produce safety rule is, what requirements there are, what record keeping they would need to do. So that way, when they do have to come under compliance, they know what they need to be doing. So that is something that we always like to focus on. So that way, you know what the produce safety rule says. And so that way you can start compliance now versus when it's all dumped on you when you get above that sales threshold. So as far as a covered farm goes, what we mean by a covered farm is under the produce safety rule, if you are above that sales average, that 3-year rolling produce sales average above that 30,509, that does mean you would have to be in full compliance with the produce safety rule, meaning you'd be subject to initial and routine inspections. And then on those inspections, the records that an inspector would be looking for. Again, this is the record webinar, so we will be going over which ones are required and then which ones are kind of, if you do this, then. So with that being said, here are the exemptions again. So qualified exempt, commercial exempt, and then there is discretionary exempt or enforcement discretion. I'll be going over each of these. Now, with these exemptions, they are after you are above that sales threshold, right? So if you're micro exempt, you cannot be qualified exempt, commercial exempt, or discretionary or enforcement exempt until you come under the produce safety rule. So having to be in full compliance, but there's always exemptions to the rule. We're going to go over each one of these and then go over covered farms and then kind of go into what record requirements are there for each of these. Specifically for qualified exempt, it's your annual food sales below that 610,182. That is adjusted for inflation each year. Now notice how I said food sales and not produce sales. So food sales would include if you do any meat, eggs, cheese, any kind of canning, anything along those lines, that would have to be included in that number. And then with the qualified exempt, there is a verification and attestation to this status on an annual basis. You might be asking yourself, how can I do that? If you're registering with the program every year, you are already doing that. There's a question during the registration that asks, is your food sales below this number and are you selling to qualified end users? If you select yes, typically you would hear from me, Sarah Music, on who are your qualified end users, high level, so then we can kind of get a better idea if you are qualified exempt or not. But that is done during the registration process. So then what is a qualified end user? Because more than half of those food sales would have to go to them. That would be literally the person who's consuming it. So direct to end consumer, that could be a CSA, farmer's market, restaurant, retail stores that are within the state of Colorado or within 275 miles of your farm. Just, if you're on the border of Colorado, you can sell into Utah, or New Mexico or Nebraska or Kansas, depending on where on the state line you are. So that kind of gives you that range. Now, where it gets tricky, why I have here is do not include wholesale distribution centers, is grocery stores are a direct end or are considered a qualified end user. However, you have to sell to them directly. Meaning if you're selling to their distribution center, then that doesn't count. So a lot of the ones here in the state do have a distribution center, specifically the ones that come to my, top of my head, King Soopers, Safeway, Walmart, any of the big guys, but even Whole Foods and Sprouts, they have distribution centers in Denver. So if you can show an invoice that you specifically sell to that specific store, it does count. With the qualified end users, it gets very gray very quickly. So if you have any questions on if you think you may qualify for that qualified end user, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation on that, because it is very farm to farm specific. So each farm is going to be different. But yeah, any of your qualified end users, I'd be more than happy to go over. As far as commercial exempt, so this means that all of your produce is going through a commercial processing that, and this is what I call legalese, that adequately reduces pathogens. So what does that mean? That just means, is it going through a kill step? So if there were any pathogens, they're getting killed off through the heating or the curing process. So the examples I list below, right? Wine making, beer making, if you're canning, juicing, making tomato paste, any kind of manufacturing where the raw agricultural commodity is being turned into something else. That is what a commercial exempt is, and it has to be all of your produce. It can't be some, it can't be a little bit. So a good example of what we see here in the state is like with chilies, right? Those Pueblo chilies or Anaheims or any of those hot peppers. Some of them, some farms may think they're commercial exempt because they roast chilies. However, it has to be all of them. It can't be that you sell them to the customer and then they take them home and roast them. It has to be all done there in order for you to say that you're commercially exempt. What isn't considered a kill step is if you use a sanitizer in your water. So typically, like with leafy greens, if they're washing them, they typically use some kind of sanitizer, Sanidate as an example. And that is not considered a kill step just because it's not killing the pathogens off. It's just preventing cross contamination. So with this one, it is making sure that kill step it's being heated. So then that way it's preventing pathogens from growing. Enforcement discretion. So this one, specifically for this state, we see a lot of wine, grapes, and hops. With these, there is a rarely consumed raw list, and it's exhaustive. So anything on that list does not fall under the rule. But if it's not on that list, it is covered under the rule. So wine, grapes, and hops are not on that list. So naturally, that means they fall under the produce safety rule. However, the FDA does recognize that specifically wine, grapes, and hops go through post-production, meaning it goes through a commercial processing because it's going through the beer making process, wine making process. So you would probably fall under the commercial exempt. However, it's up until it becomes wine, where does it fall? So currently what we're doing is that it's not subject to inspection. However, we could do a record inspection just to make sure, like, do you have the proper record keeping to show that your wine, grapes, and or hops are going through a commercial kill step? So that's what that's all about. So if you see enforcement discretion or discretionary exempt, it's talking about these. So records, review which ones are required for covered farms and each of those exemptions. So that way, if you are eligible for an inspection, you would know what an inspector would be looking for so that you can either pull them and have them available and ready to go, or making sure that it's all there so that way it's quick and easy when an inspector comes. So specifically for qualified exempt records, you would have to show records. However, it would just be a record inspection. It wouldn't be a full field inspection. So they would come out. What would they be looking for? They would want to make sure that your food sales are below that threshold, right? That $610,000 number that I gave you. So they would want to see your 3-year sales for your food for 2020, 2021, and 2022 is at that number to make sure that, okay, you meet that, right? And then showing who your qualified end users are. So making sure that it's in the same state and then within that 275 miles. So how that's done, there's multiple different ways. You can show an invoice if you use QuickBooks. However, receipts, however you do it, to make sure that you can show, like, here are my qualified end users. These are our sales for our farmers market. This is who we're selling to. Here's our CSA list. Any of those to show that qualified end user and how it's being paid is what an inspector would be looking for. So with this exemption, it focuses a lot on invoicing and your food sales. So making sure that those records are up to date to show that you are exempt. And then this is just a template. If you kind of wanted to just walk through it yourself, however, again, you do attest to that qualified exempt status during the registration process. Again, done on an annual basis. So if you're registering with us every year, you're already doing it. However, if you kind of want to see, okay, here are my sales, this is my average, my qualified end users, is that above the 50% threshold? You're more than welcome to do that. But you're already attesting to it during the registration process. However, this kind of breaks it down so that way you can kind of get a better picture of what your farm does. As far as commercial exempt, there are record requirements for this. Again, that first bullet, that's what it has to say, is a written assurance. It has to show that it's gone through the procedures to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. That's the wording that needs to be there. So what is that saying? Is your produce, all of your produce, going through a kill step? Is it going through some kind of commercial process so that way any pathogens that are there are getting killed off? Now, that's if you are doing the winemaking yourself, as an example. Now, if you're selling your grapes to someone who's going to be doing that for you, then they have to give you that written assurance of that these wine grapes are going to go through a process that's going to eliminate the pathogens. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide here, which is right here. So as you can see, farm disclosure or a buyer written assurance. So if you're selling it to someone, this could be an example of what it would look like. This has all the legal wording that you would need to have. Do you need to use these templates? Absolutely not. But this would be the information that would be needed. And this could be put on an invoice or however you want to do it. But this is just an example of what a template could look like. So these resources that I will be showing, I'll be doing a follow-up email. So then that way you have all of these. So if you would like to use them, you can, but you're not required to use the resources that we provide. And then as far as enforcement discretion, again, since most of them, again, is through that winemaking and beer making, is making sure that you have those commercial exempt records, have them for 2 years. So showing that it's going through that kill step, that's what you would do for the enforcement discretion or discretionary exempt. So wine, grapes, hops, and also almonds, but I know in the state of Colorado, there isn't a lot of that. So covered farm. So what specifically, again, high level, what do just in general, what do records need to have to be in compliance with the produce safety rule? So the retention time for most records is 2 years. The reason why I say most is again for your sales, for your produce sales, that's 3, right? Because it's a 3-year rolling average. But for most other records, it's going to be 2 years. Most of them must be reviewed by an appropriate employee, such as a supervisor or what the rule says, or a responsible party. So if you have a food safety manager or someone who does your training, or it could just be you because you have to wear many hats because you're just not big enough to hire someone to do specific food safety stuff, making sure that the appropriate person is signing them. So some records do require a signature and date. I'll kind of be, again, we'll be going over the different records and which ones would require a signature. And again, we do have template records, and so it will have on those which ones specifically would need to be signed and dated by a supervisor once they're filled out. And then upon request, again, if you're getting inspected, they'd be letting you know, and you would have to provide those records within 24 hours. The reason behind that is if you store them off site, that gives you enough time to retrieve them, be able to pull them together, any of the information that would be needed or what was requested, you would be able to provide. And then whatever format you want your records to be in, so long as they're meeting the requirements, again, we'll kind of be going over what is needed on each of the records. So long as it meets that, it can be in whatever format works best for you. Does that mean that it's just as simple as a written one? As an example, if you're doing, a temperature log for your cooler, is it just attached to the cooler and then every time it's, filled in, it's put into a binder? That works just fine. You can use a paper one. Nothing in the rule says you can't. Or if you want to be a little bit more techy, if it's electronic, that works as well. So long as you have them in one place and would be able to pull them up when a inspector requests them, that works. So either paper or electronic, whichever you would like to do, or even an app. There's so many apps out there nowadays that if you just have to pull up an app, that works as well. And then as far as personnel, right? So the first one is worker training. So there is a requirement in the rule that anyone that's coming on your farm that's a worker is required to get an annual training. And that does include family members. If you use volunteers or any of your workers, typically I know here in Colorado it's H2A, but any workers that come, they do need to have on those records the date of the training, what topics were covered, and then names and signatures of those that were trained. And then again, this one specifically must be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. So making sure that extra step of, okay, I know they were trained, is going to sign at the bottom, date it, and then you'll be good to go. What would that look like? Similar to this. So a worker training, as you see here, name and address of the farm, trainer who trained them, right? Topics covered. So it should cover over, health and hygiene, any specific, if they're just going to be harvesting, did they get job specific training, any of that, employee name, then their signature so they understand. And this could be, them watching a video or looking through slides or having a trainer train them, whichever way you want to, that's fine. This one again needs to be signed and dated at the bottom by a supervisor or responsible party, i.e. the owner, to make sure that that is within compliance. As far as agricultural water, I know we did an ag webinar last month, but just again, high level for the records, going to cover it. The rule does say that on an annual basis that your water system does need to be inspected, so that way it's not becoming a source of contamination. So making sure that your pipes and your hoses and gaskets and all of that are in good working condition. If they're not, replacing them and then having a record showing this was what was defective, this is what I changed. So then that way it's documented that this is something that we'll have to monitor, right? As far as testing records, again, going to just high level for harvest and post-harvest water, it needs to show no detectable generic E. coli. If you're getting a water quality test from a lab, I'd be happy if anyone needs to send you a list of labs that do that in the state of Colorado, or even in the US. Municipal water, you don't have to test your municipal water, but if you have any reason to believe that it's not of good sanitary quality, you're more than welcome to test it. However, you would just need to get the records from either the city or county or wherever you're getting your municipal water, showing that certificate of conformance that it's up to the EPA drinking water standard, and that's all that you would need. And again, all of these for 2 years. Water treatment monitoring. So the last three are if applicable. So if you had a situation where you needed to treat your water, or you treat your water for harvest and post-harvest, meaning, you use Sanidate to make sure because you use batch water, or you just use it to prevent cross-contamination. Again, if applicable, again for 2 years. Corrective actions, so anything that you found in your ag water system or with your agricultural water in general, again having a record. And again, I'll be showing what those templates could look like, so that way you know what needs to be on there. And then with harvest and post-harvest water, the scientific method for treating surface water, because you aren't allowed to use surface water for harvest and post-harvest if it's not treated. And that's just specifically for surface water. So any scientific method you use for treating it, you would also have to show that. So that way you show that the water meets the no detectable generic E. coli for going forward. And again, that's if applicable. And so this is what a water system inspection record would look like. You have your date, the time, what part of the distribution system. So I know some farms have multiple different areas and where that water comes from. So if you have multiple sources, making sure that you're labeling what the appropriate water source is, any observations that were, if there's any corrective actions needed, and then initials of the person who did it, right? So making sure that it's filled in. So then that way, again, your 2 years, you can be able to show that, yes, we did a water system inspection. This is what we found, if you found anything, and then moving on. Water treatment, again, if applicable. So if you're using it for harvest and post-harvest, making sure, the date and time, if you do pH or water temperature, turbidity, making sure that you're documenting it. If you're using a sanitizer, specifically if you're using chlorine, I always want to put an asterisk there of making sure that your water temperature isn't too high and your pH isn't too low, because you could have that chlorine gas off, and which meaning you create chlorine gas, which could be a hazard to your workers. So making sure that it's within that realm and isn't going to be a hazard, right? So this, again, if you do water treatment for going forward. And then again, for corrective actions, here's a template record, right? So making sure if you needed to do any corrective actions on your water, needing to do a die-off rate, making sure that the die-off, half log a day for whatever your CFU number was. The rule says 126, so colony forming units. So making sure that it's there, and then waiting the time interval that you need to do. If you want a die-off calculator, I'd be more than happy to share that with you. But then here's a record template of what that can look like if, again, applicable. So then we're getting into how you pronounce that is BSOW, so biological soil amendment of animal origin. If you use compost or any kind of fertilizer of animal nature, meaning if you use manure, I listed a few here, any feather, blood, bone meal. I know a lot of people use fish emulsion or agricultural teas, making sure that that's not going to create any issues. So if you are doing your own compost, you're not buying it from someone, you do have to have records showing the time and temperature and turnings in order to make sure that if there are any pathogens that they're being that they die off, right? So the magic number is 131 degrees, making sure that it's being hit, and then testing it in about 3 different places just to make sure that it's getting to that temperature to kill off any pathogens. And especially if you're turning it or aerating it, making sure that it's hitting that 131 degrees over 15 days with a minimum of 5 turnings. And this one, again, if you're doing your own compost, it must be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. So then that way you're monitoring to make sure, is it hitting the correct temperatures? If not, why? And then doing any corrective actions if necessary. Now, I know a lot of farms do buy their soil amendments from a third party. So just making sure to get the records from the company showing the process that they do to treat it. So either static or non-static, aerated, not aerated are the two, and that it's handled, conveyed, and stored to minimize the risk of contamination, making sure that the pathogens aren't in there. So typically I've heard, that certificate of conformance, you can just get it from your compost person. If that is something that you do, a lot of people use chemical fertilizers, which don't fall under this. You wouldn't need to have this. It's just because with the risk of using raw manure, that there could be pathogenic E. coli because animals naturally carry it, E. coli or salmonella, and that runs the risk of there being the pathogenic line in there. So making sure that it's being killed off is the best option. And then again, here's a record template. You don't have to use this one, but here it shows the date turned, the temperature of the different areas, and then of course the initials of the person who did it. And then it doesn't show it at the bottom, but you would also have to sign and date. A supervisor would have to sign and date. Cleaning and sanitizing. So this one is required because you have to keep a record of what was cleaned, date of cleaning, how it was cleaned, sanitized. If you sanitize your equipment, you should. And it's only for equipment that you use in growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of your covered produce. So if you do other things, it's just the equipment that's being touched. What are your food contact areas, right? What equipment do you use? A conveyor belt? Do you use a dump tank? Do you use any, harvesting tools such as knives or shears? Anything that's a touch point to produce, kind of thinking through that. Do you use some kind of cleaning? How often do you clean? The rule doesn't give a specific timetable. It says as adequate and necessary. So whenever that timeline is for you, but an inspector would be looking to see these records. So that way you are in compliance, but also cleaning and sanitizing are not the same. You cannot sanitize a dirty surface. So just putting Sanidate on something without fully cleaning it first does not do what you think it's going to do. Cleaning means, washing it down, using a brush, using even Dawn dish soap, right? Using some kind of soap, cleaning that off, and then going in with a sanitizer. So cleaning and sanitizing, making sure that that's done correctly so then you can show a clean break. And then this one, again, also needs to be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. Again, here's an example of what a record could look like. So the date, the time that it was cleaned, what was cleaned, right? So they use harvest tools and they have a dump tank. So, and then listing, was it just cleaned? Was it cleaned and sanitized? Was it just sanitized? what method they used. Again, they say here, cleaning SOP. So making sure if you have a standard operating procedure that it's written down so then someone could follow it, right? How you clean, and then how you sanitize, how you make sure that sanitizer is being effective. And then, of course, the initials of the employee that did it. And then there are other records. Again, if you do it, you need to have a record of it. So these are the big ones, right? So pre-harvest assessment. So if you're seeing animal intrusion in your fields, you need to have a record of that. If you are seeing it and then marking it, however that's done on your farm is up to you. However, any animal intrusion and corrective actions that were taken do need to be documented. And the pre-harvest assessment is walking your fields before harvest to see if there is an animal intrusion, and then again documenting it. However, we also know that animals could come in after you've done that assessment. So if workers are working through the fields, that if they are seeing any animal intrusion, that they know what corrective actions they need to take. If that means creating a buffer zone, if they had actually touched poop, washing their hands, anything like that, whatever your policy is, making sure it's documented and your workers are aware of it. As far as pest control, you're going to see this more with buildings, right? So if you don't have a building, if you just harvest and you field pack and then it goes somewhere else, that's pest control isn't going to be something that you're going to be required to do. However, if you're an indoor facility or if you're a greenhouse or if you have a packing or holding facility or a cooler, you would have to have records of pest control. So what does that look like? That could be just again, I can show a record here of, you check the traps, do you have a certain amount of time that you check them? Is it every week, every day, every couple days? Whatever your operating procedure is, that would be something an inspector would be looking for. And if you don't want to do it, but you hire a third party, just making sure you get those invoices, right? Orkin, how often are they checking the traps? Is that enough? Do you need them to come out more often, depending on what pest? Now, what is a pest? The rule considers them any rodents or birds, anything that can get in. So it's not just mice they're worried about, it's also birds. So if birds can get into your packing house, making sure that you're not giving them a place to be able to roost. If you're seeing any bird activity, making sure that you're getting them out, right? Destroying their nests, and not providing them a place to stay. So as far as resources, I will be sending out a required records fact sheet that was made by the Produce Safety Alliance and the FDA. I do have record templates for all the ones that I have shown today. So that way, if you don't have them, you are more than welcome to use these. Now, if you have a gap audit, you are more than welcome to use the same records. You don't have to, reinvent the wheel. So long as they meet the requirements that I've outlined here, that's perfectly acceptable. And then, of course, our Produce Safety Program website, we have a bunch of different materials on there that you would be more than welcome to look at. So that way, again, you have all the information that you need. But I will be sending out the top two there in my follow-up email. Or again, questions, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free if you need those template records, I'd be more than happy to send them. And any questions that people may have, I would be more than happy to do so. So with that, I will stop the recording. But of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you.